Welcome back to the Carrot and Stick podcast, a podcast series where we look to get under the skin of all things sales performance management and motivation to understand what makes our wonderful world of recruitment tick. Today, I'm sitting down with Alex Elliott. Alex was the founder of Liquid Personnel, or co-founder, I suppose, to give some fair credit to his other co-founder, was one of the co-founders of Liquid Personnel, a business that sold back in 2016 to a private equity firm, 140 staff, 9 figures of revenue, wildly successful business. And over the last 8 years, Alex has gone on to invest in multiple recruitment and recruitment tech businesses, while also doing advisory services as well. He, like me, is a massive data and process nerd. So that's why we start our talk today. Maybe not the most riveting topic for some of you, but really interesting insights. We go through what he thinks are the most important processes to have documented and instilled inside your business, and ultimately why that is so important, why he has such a high bar for hiring standards and how he believes that helped Liquid become so successful. And then we round things out on how things have changed since the Liquid days. What has he seen changing in terms of culture and how businesses tend to work, and what he believes is going to be the future. This was a really good chat, really in-depth compared to some other episodes that we've done. And I think there's tons of insight packed in here for founders out there who are wondering, what does growing and scaling my business really start to look like? Well, without further ado, let's start answering those questions with Alex Elliott. Alex, thank you so much for coming on, mate. Really appreciate you jumping on today. And it was lovely to chat to you earlier on about some of the investments that you got into. I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later. Before we dig into what we're going to talk about today, do you want to give everyone a quick intro first to yourself, your background, what you're doing today? Who the hell is Alex Elliott?
Sure. So I am a recruitment guy. How about that for an intro?
I'm a recruitment guy.
I'm a recruitment guy. I co-founded with my business partner a company in 2006, Liquid. That was a healthcare contract recruitment, predominantly business. We scaled that over 10 years to just over 100 million revenue, 11 million NFI, 4 million EBIT, something like that. So it was 140 headcount. So it was a really good story, which on the outside looks like it was all smooth sailing, but far from it. We exited that in 2016 via a private equity-backed recruitment group. And since then, I've had my fingers in various pies, recruitment and rec tech orientated startups, where I do a bit of advisory work as well as investing cash. So how about that for an intro?
I really like it, mate. The rec tech side must be quite interesting, because I guess being on the side of a business that's gone through from nothing to 140 plus people, 9 figures of revenue as well. That's a really insightful journey that you've been on that you can then use and help advise those companies with, right?
Well, yeah, that's true. I know the market well, and I think that gives me a bit of an edge with regards to understanding what I'm looking at and the potential value, i.e. the problem solution sort of situation of what different pieces of tech could bring. But I think also, if you look at recruitment, it's one of those industries which is so ripe for transformation from a tech perspective, simply because it's so headcount orientated. So the business model has always been so headcount orientated with regards to how you grow. And I think if you look at the business model as a whole, recruitment, how much time does a recruiter spend doing non-really high value sales orientated tasks?
Too much.
Like literally up to 70% some recruiters of their time is spent doing non-sales. So when I say non-sales, I mean non-high value sales stuff. So I think if you look at that and you look at the potential changes that are going on in the tech industry, I think over the next 5 years or so, the business models of successful recruitment companies are going to change hugely. And, it's quite interesting, therefore, to be involved in some of those businesses and what's going on.
I love it. And plenty of more, I'm sure, to come as well. And the constant talk is all about AI at the moment, but I'm pretty sure there'll be far more innovations around the corner that none of us are really thinking about right now. And that's the wonders of the modern world, I think, is things do just change incredibly quickly. But some things don't really change, because we had a talk earlier on about the 3 things that we want to go through today. And some of these things look back at that time at Liquid, look back on your lessons through the advisory work you've done. First one was around process and data. As the business scales, I think we all know that process and data become super important, but at what stage, what that looks like, when it should be a thing people think about. We'll talk through that. Second one is being big on hiring standards. And I think this is a really interesting area, because I think every business leader will say getting the right people is important. But then when it actually comes to tactically doing it, they start making allowances. They let little slips happen here and there. And before you know it, you've got a problem on your hands. And the third one is how things have changed since Liquid Personnel, which really comes back to what we just said a second ago. You've seen a lot in that journey that you went on. The world has changed a lot in 8 years. I can't believe how much has happened since 2016. It feels absolutely terrifying, but I'm sure that there's tons that we can go through there as well. Should we start at the top and go on the process and data point? Because I'm an engineer by trade. I love process. I love data. You're speaking to the right person, but I bet there are plenty out there thinking, we're a small business. We don't need to worry about process and data too much now. Or arguably there are businesses with 50 plus people who are thinking, oh my God, process and data is everything to us right now. Why do you think it's so underutilized?
Well, I love the fact you started off by saying you're a process and data guy, because I'm definitely not an engineer, Derry, but I am 100%, a process and data guy. And by the way, we've probably just lost half of our audience with this. This
You've got two
topic.
of the most boring people in the world about to start talking about process and data.
We're
I'm
about
so
to
sorry.
geek out like massively on process and data. But for me, process and data, I would incorporate kind of data into my process. When I talk about process as a whole, I kind of incorporate data into that because the two things fit so tightly from a science of sales and scaling perspective. I think it is one of those subject matters that, understandably so, lots of recruiters or business leaders, recruitment leaders, especially if they've gone in and set up their own recruitment company for the first time, I do think their eyes glaze over a little bit, potentially. And I think also it's one of those things which is really, really undervalued with regards to how fundamental it is to be able to successfully continue scaling your business. I think in the early days, when you are starting out and your recruitment company is small, let's say, 10, 15, 20 heads, I think because you as the business leader, or maybe there's two of you even better as the business leaders, I think as you're growing that business, everything is in your head and you are so closely involved with your team on a day-to-day basis where you're literally sitting alongside them. You're teaching them by osmosis. You're coaching them directly, really proactively. I think at that point, everything's in your head. And do you need to be mapping out and documenting your processes and sales books? Probably not, because at that point, I don't think that would be the right point maybe to be sort of looking at that from a transition perspective. But I think if you want to grow beyond that point, I think at that point it's about delegating leadership and coaching and responsibilities to other people and building out your middle management layer. I think at that point, if you don't have your core sales processes mapped out and documented, and this is always a case of ongoing improvement. No one's going to get it right the first time, but I think that's when it becomes absolutely critical to be able to scale your business from, say, 20 heads to 50. I think that's one of the most fundamental things you have to do as a business. You have to build sales books, and we can go into those processes in a bit of detail if you want. But I think first and foremost, appreciating the importance of what great process brings to your business with regards to those different inflection points of scaling is super, super important. And then I think the second bit is understanding, well, what does great process look like? What are great sales books? And again, that's quite a challenging subject because you can over engineer and you can under engineer. So I think it's important to be able to build. And again, that stuff takes time, right? I typically over engineer, and then I have to work my way backwards and figure out actually what is an optimal process rather than probably something which is a little bit too much. So the importance of process and also then digging into what great process looks like, I think is really important for most business leaders within this space.
And because we're both a bit of an advocate of process, I'll be the devil's advocate here and kind of be the challenger. I remember when we first had a VP sales join our business and we hired a single SDR, a single person whose job it was to go and book meetings with the recruitment industry. We handed them like a 103-page playbook, and I was just like, this feels a little bit excessive. And that'll probably be the concern I imagine for many leaders out there is, okay, cool, I get it. You're telling me the end state is, if we're going to go to this size, we need process in place, people that will reinforce it. Why should I give a shit today? How do I even get started with this whole process thing in the first place? And you said there, the golden rule that I've once heard is if you find yourself saying something twice, write it down, because you're going to have to say it again at some point if you've already said it twice, right? But what does this actually look like in terms of a process? Is it a template that you'd use and then simply amend based on what the process is? Are they training videos that you're creating? How are you making sure the process is actually followed? How do you build a culture of adhering to process, for example? And I guess also quite importantly, how do you teach people how to do it properly? Because it's all good saying, I've written up a document, please follow this every time moving forwards. We know full well most salespeople want to be on the phone, not sat there reading process documents and learning how to follow something down to the nth degree. How did you get that sort of stuff rolled out when you were in Liquid, for example?
It's a big question, Derek.
It's a very big question. I got to ask you the hairy ones.
That's tough. So I I think first and foremost, figuring out what your business needs from a process perspective is the fundamental starting point. Otherwise, I think it's like the Pareto's law. 20% of your stuff gets 80% of your results. Therefore, from a playbook perspective, I think it's important to figure out what the really, really critical, important stuff is and focus on that primarily, rather than the 20% of stuff, which is the 80% of stuff, which is, maybe it's not 80%, which is only going to bring in 20%. For me, that as a starting point, I think every sales business, regardless of what type of sales it is, I think there's 5 core sales processes. Okay. So for recruitment, I believe call management is a fundamental sales process, number one. Second is territory management. And within recruitment, that's broken down into 2 aspects. You've got delivery and you've got BD. Third is opportunity management. Fourth is account management. And then the missing piece of that, the 5th core sales process, is sales enablement, which is basically your coaching framework as to how you coach people against those 4 sales processes that I've described.
Makes sense.
So I think understanding what good sales process is, first and foremost, is really important. So you want to understand the different categories of process which are relevant to all sales companies. And then what you can do is you can take the first one, call management. It's all about being able to whiteboard what good call management looks like. So in recruitment, let's say the first call is a candidate pitch from the delivery side. Look at delivery, it might be a candidate pitch. And I'll be really, really broad with this stuff. The second touch point might be a full qualification. The third touch point might be interview prep. The 4th touch point might be interview debrief. The 5th touch point might be offer management. So I think in a lot of recruitment businesses, there will be additional processes to that. But if you can then whiteboard out what your typical sales process looks like from a call management process, I think that gives you super clarity as a business with regards to what good and great practice looks like. And then that gives you the ability to be able to coach against that in a really forensic, scientific manner, utilizing data to be able to understand where the key blockages are in someone's sales funnels, whether it's via call management, territory management, opportunity management, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot in there, but I think for me, that's the starting point, is understanding what your core sales processes are, understanding the things that are really going to move the needle from a sales perspective, building those processes, having alignment within the business as to what's important and why. And that's so important, because you as the business leader, if you just build the processes and say, go away and do this stuff, there's going to be a lack of engagement, a lack of buy-in, a lack of alignment. And the truth is everyone will just ignore it anyway. And then once you've got those 4 core sales processes mapped out and documented, for me, then it's about the really important bit, is sales enablement, which is effectively, okay, well, how do our managers coach against these processes? And then you build in proactive, structured coaching to ensure that each consultant, based upon an appropriate frequency, is getting the right level of training on call management, opportunity management, territory management, and account management on a regular basis, to ensure that you're constantly being proactive with your coaching rather than reactive when things have already gone wrong. I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but
it does. Yeah, the one thing that frustrates me a lot of times when you listen to other, not necessarily always other podcasts, but other resources, for example, in the industry, people will give this kind of high level overview of, process is really important. Like I say, write a few processes, make sure people follow them, but not really too tactical on what those processes should be or how they should be followed. And I feel you've answered that really, really well there. I guess the one thing I'll probably come on to more in terms of the tactical execution of this as well. You've got your processes documented out. You've done it quite early on. Say you're at 5 heads. You think, maybe it's a good time to start getting this down. By the time you get to 9, 10 people, you've learned a whole ton more, and the processes are changing again. Do you see sales enablement as that thing that keeps on the reinforcement of, hey, look, here's how the process has changed. Here's new things that we're trying. Let's retrain you on what this process is. How often are you looking at doing that with staff who have already learned a previous process, but now maybe you find a better way to do it? Because a classic example in sales is phone scripts can be changed. We can find ways to improve them. Maybe email templates that you might use. You find new ones that work better and you want those to be used by the team instead. How often are you reinforcing or reviewing these processes to make sure they're a living, breathing document?
I think initially when you're building out, before you get in, let's say, a head of sales enablement, an L&D manager, whatever that title is, who will take on a lot of those responsibilities, I think as a business leader, your responsibility is to understand where your biggest leverage points are, or where your biggest blockages are. Going back to what we were discussing earlier, this is why data and process are the two fundamental building blocks with regards to the science of how you scale. So my argument would be, as a business leader, that I am constantly reviewing where my biggest blockages are as a business. And look, I don't know, it could be any example here. Let's say interview to placement ratio, because it's such an obvious one, right? Interview to placement ratio. If my interview to placement ratio is below where I know it should be or believe it could be, or I can see within the business there's a real if you stat ranked your consultants, and you could see some have got twice as good an interview to placement ratio as others, I would say that's a fundamental issue you can dive into. Or you could look at the business as a whole and say, why is our interview to placement ratio X when I believe it should be Y? If you're looking at data on a regular basis, I think your job as a business leader is to identify one, absolute maximum two at a time things that you should be driving from an improvement perspective. So rather than saying, look, there is a structured time that you should be looking at this stuff and this is how often you should implement it, I think it's literally saying, right, what are the one, maybe two things at a time that we should be really driving as a business to improve? And you know what? Until we actually get to the point where those two things, maximum, ideally one in most scenarios, until we've got to the point where the data is supporting the fact that our performance standards are now at the level where they should be, I'm not going to worry about anything, because I have prioritized those things as the most important things that are going to leverage my performance as a business. So if you can do a coaching, development, training program based upon those one fundamental two things, and you move the needle with regards to the data that shows that actually you're seeing those improvements, you obviously need to maintain that moving forward and make sure it doesn't slip down again. But at that point, for me, it's then about, okay, well, what are the next one or two things? And at that point, you then start prioritizing again. So everything's about prioritization, everything's about data, everything's about understanding where the process is falling down, and also having strong coaching fundamentals where you don't get people to drink from the fire hose and just keep chucking stuff at them thinking it's going to make a difference. It's not. It's much better to, less is more from a coaching and development perspective if you prioritize effectively.
I love that. And I think the main thing I've taken away from that is, don't feel like you can shove the whole thing on someone all at once. Say, right, all of this, you've got to worry about it all at once. Everything's got to be perfect from day one. Just pick a thing at a time and see it as an ongoing process, and not something that has to be done inside of a week, for example. Don't feel like it has to be overloaded onto someone, right?
I read once, and I loved it. I said, what did it say? It suggested that, look, to be a good business leader, you have to let fires burn. And I thought that was really, really interesting and really insightful, because I agree. There are constant problems in your business, and there's constant areas where you can see improvement opportunities. The truth is, you've just got to let some of it go. And that's not to suggest you won't get to it, but typically a lot of the things you've got to do is prioritize more effectively to understand those leverage points and just focus in on those really small number of things which are going to have the biggest impact. And that means letting some fires burn.
Massively. It's one thing I learned really on as a business leader was, like you're saying, I wanted to be perfect at everything. Because I think we've all used a bit of software or interacted with a service of some kind where a part of it just doesn't feel great. Maybe the dashboard feels a little bit out of date, or the help documents just feel a bit underwhelming and could be a lot better. Maybe some part of what they provided you with just isn't quite up to scratch. You think, man, why aren't they fixing that? And it comes down to this piece you said there, which really is about focus. Like, where are you relentlessly driving, not just yourself, but the whole business around? What number are you focused on? Everything else is largely an afterthought. It'll be good to say, I'm just going to spend half a day today doing this over here and improving that. Before you know it, that becomes half of your week, and you're not getting anywhere near the goal that you should be, what the focus that you've tried to drive around through process or objective setting or whatever else it is, right? Well, we're coming so into macro here about the whole thing around objective setting in a business as well, but I think it is all very pertinent and it all wraps in together, right?
OKRs. OKRs are another great driver of data, isn't it?
We've tried those a few times. I'm not a massive fan,
Really?
Yeah, I don't know what. I don't know. I couldn't really. I think.
What were the reasons you think it didn't work?
I think because we were trying to conform too heavily to the OKR framework with the way that things were written up and what you were and weren't measuring, for example, and that kind of got us a little bit tied up in the process rather than actually focusing on what is it we really want to make a difference on here today. The whole thing around, like, really you got to pick 3 or 4 key results, find numbers that influence a certain objective you're trying to achieve. We just get so wrapped up in trying to find numbers that we could put to certain objectives that we knew we really wanted to do in our hearts, but couldn't proper justify. And so across the business in place, we say, well, let's just find a way to make it fit and go and do it anyway. When in reality, we probably shouldn't have done that. So I think it's definitely on us for not doing it correctly, I think, or us trying to overcomplicate it.
I think, yeah, it's interesting. Like, you can't always put data to stuff, can you? Especially when you're growing. And it's hard to know what you should be aiming for sometimes when you're fast growth. That's difficult as well. What's a realistic but stretched goal? For me, the real value of OKRs as you grow is aligning different business units with regards to the common goal. And if you can get that cultural alignment where everyone understands what their particular department is doing towards kind of the greater good of, what your long-term goals are as a business, for me, that created more of a unified business, rather than maybe having a marketing department, a sales department, an ops department, a compliance department, a payroll department, and they're all just different entities, right? Whereas all of a sudden it felt more like we were one unified organization rather than...
Colin, me curious, when you did OKRs then, were you assigning them at team level or were you assigning to individuals? Because we've got a few clients that use OKRs and they'll have them assigned to individuals and it's top of their mind every single morning. What are my main objectives I'm going for this quarter? Am I trying to improve a certain ratio that has sucked for the last couple of quarters? Am I focused on better engagement with existing accounts rather than new business, right? And they try and build everything around that. How have you approached it historically?
Yeah, I'd suggest that you can do it at team level and individual level, because I think that's the logical thing again, because if you've got a business target, and let's just like really boring, right? Sales, let's say revenue. We want to achieve this level of revenue. It's a nice simple one to discuss. You break that down into team level with regards to what they're forecasting, and then the consultants have to break it down and say what they're going to bring to the table based upon that team forecast. So maybe it's easier for sales businesses rather than pure tech businesses, where you've got more difference between the different types of business unit and their responsibility and function. But yeah, from a sales perspective, I think it's reasonably easy and logical to break it down from business wide to team wide to business unit to team to individual.
Massively interesting. We could go into objective setting all day long. I do want to go on to that hiring standards one, because the depth we've gone there and around process, I think, is actually really good. That level of depth is great. Let's do it on the hiring side. Because like I said earlier on, so many leaders that I hear and speak to say, yeah, team is the most important thing for growth. Like, no dickheads allowed in our company, all the rest of it. Then there's nothing really too much that's tactical about how they actually went about doing that. And you said you've always been big on hiring standards. It wound some people up historically. What did you do that was so egregious to some people?
I don't necessarily think egregious, but I do think as an industry we're not selective enough all the time with regards to the people we invite into the industry. And I think also we're not compassionately pragmatic enough about who stays in the industry beyond that first probation period. So I just tend to be quite direct, and I think that winds people up a little bit sometimes. But for me, I think I talk about this a lot. I think from a hiring standard perspective on a sales floor, you should always be aiming to bring in people who you believe can be top quartile performers. And I said the same thing on a podcast recently. If I aim for an A player and they turn out to be a B player, an average performer, that's okay. But if I aim for just the average, the downside of that is if that person doesn't live up to standard, you end up with a C level performer, i.e. an underperformer from a billing perspective. And your job as a sales leader or a business leader is to move that bell curve, your performance bell curve of what it looks like on the sales floor. Your job is to move that from left to right on the axis, right? So I think first and foremost, you have to set really high standards from a hiring perspective. And also, I believe it's those really, really top performers who tend to be the ones that you can then, who have leadership potential as well, who also give you the ability to continue scaling your business. Because effectively, if you hire lots and lots of good recruiters, but none of them have leadership potential, it very, very quickly happens that all of a sudden, a recruitment business is like a pyramid. If you don't keep hiring at least one exceptional sales leader who works out for every 6 new hires, roughly, very, very quickly you're going to flatline, or the business is going to start crumbling because you don't have the coaching and management infrastructure in place to be able to manage the number of consultants that you have. So I think first and foremost, there are a couple of reasons why I think it's really important to have hiring standards. I don't think we define our briefs well enough, which is crazy when you think it's recruitment. But I think we go into the hiring process, and I believe lots of recruitment companies end up hiring based upon rapport and likability and stuff like that, rather than the fundamental things. Now, don't get me wrong, likability is important in recruitment, of course it is, but it should not be the fundamental decision working process where someone comes in and says, yeah, I want to earn 100k a year, I'm really driven, and the manager really, really likes them, and that's enough for them to get them a job. I think we have to be a lot more defined with regards to the brief of what we're looking for. I stole something from the SaaS industry, which is ICE, with 2 C's: intelligence, character, coachability, experience. I think that's a good way to categorize the types of things you might want to be thinking about from a brief perspective. I think once you've defined those things, and intelligence might be emotional intelligence, it might be general intelligence. Character could be all sorts of things: conscientiousness, grit, drive, whatever it might be. Coachability, pretty obvious. Then experience, again, are you looking for someone who can demonstrate certain things from previous roles that align with your business? Make sure those definitions are really, really tight, and then build an interview structure which aligns with that. Again, something I see fall down a little bit is people might have a clear definition of what they're looking for, but their interview structure and the questions they ask aren't actually directly aligned with the brief that they're looking to hire on. So you end up with a lot of information, and you feel like you've taken on a lot of information, but actually it hasn't actually moved the needle with regards to making a good evidence-based decision. A scorecard is the next piece to that. So for me, it's really important to build a scorecard which is evidence-based. If you're telling me this individual is driven, what are the examples you can provide? You've given
not just a feeling, evidence. Yeah.
You've given them a 4, which is excellent. Let's talk through that. What is excellent from an evidence perspective about this person's drive? And I think if you do that on all of the things, and then if you have multiple people in the interview process, your role doesn't become saying yes or no. Your role becomes assessing the particular traits you're looking for based upon where you're at in the interview process, or what involvement you have. And then everyone comes together at the end of that process and says, okay, well, this is how I've marked them, and this is the reason why for giving them that mark. I think that acts as a brilliant way to be able to upskill your interviewers. Because if someone's saying to me, well, I give them a 4 on drive, and I turn around and say, well, I've given them a 2. Let's talk through that. What evidence do you have? What evidence do I have?
Why does that gap exist? Yeah.
It's either me or it's you.
Yeah.
It's one of us who have scored poorly, or maybe we both scored poorly. But, I think it gives you that open forum where you really help people identify what good hiring standards are, and having an evidence-based scorecard approach is fundamental to that. So a lot there, but that would be sort of and then I guess the last thing is to have those sense checks in place at the end of the process. Have some questions to ask yourself as a way of sense checking, because we are all really, I said at the beginning, it's really easy to interview on likability. The truth is we all do that, all of us. So I think you have to have some sense checking questions in place at the end to try and kind of bring out some of those blind spots which you might personally, or just generally, as we all are, be inclined towards, which are a good way to make sure you're not falling into that likability, that horns versus halo trap, those sorts of internal biases and blind spots.
Yeah, massively. And this is the one thing I think that I did for a little bit wrong last year, to be fair. We were hiring for 3 senior roles last year. We hired a sales leader, a product leader, and a marketing leader. And I know a big part, the guy actually we hired now, Chris Aiken, who's our VP of sales. I do a thing with all our processes where I'll do a little 10-minute video talking about the role, the company, about me, because I'll eventually work with them very closely. And I asked them to send one back over. And quite naturally, in a lot of those videos, my assessment was, could I see myself working with this person? Are they a nice person? Do I like them? And fundamentally, being frank, Chris is quite a reserved guy. He's quite quiet. He's not your typical sales leader. So you had some very kind of big personalities who were very excitable, were very like, yeah, I'm all about this, I'm all about that. Chris is much more reserved, much more calm in the way that he spoke. And initially I said no as a result. But then he emailed me back after saying, I appreciate why you said no, but I really think this could be a good fit. We should have a conversation. And I thought, you know what, I'll give you a go. And through talking to him, the logic then starts to prevail that this guy really knows what he's talking about. He's got the results to back it up. He's the right guy for us, even if arguably there was someone that I saw as more likable during the process. Now, it does turn out I do actually quite like him. I quite like the way that he is. That's completely fine. But by being able to put that logical barrier, I think, in front of that likability check that you do with it, whether you like it or not, you're going to do the likability check yourself. Having a logical barrier or filter that you apply to that, I think, is just so critical. And we learned from that with the latest hire, our head of product. That was very scorecard driven. We didn't put anyone through who didn't pass a scorecard, no matter how much we liked them. We reset the process at one point because no one quite fit the filters that we were after. That became much more scientific. But that was something that I learned through making the mistake in the first place, right?
We all do it. It's evolutionary psychology. We're programmed to be wary of people that we perceive as different to us.
Yeah.
So if you break it down into its most fundamental psychological elements there, right, we're all programmed to do it. So that's why it's not, you have internal biases, you have blind spots. Therefore, you need the self-awareness to be able to understand that and also put systems in place which mitigate against it. Look, you want to like the people you get on with, but it doesn't mean, I have a certain character type. The people I worked with couldn't be any more different to me sometimes. I still liked them, but, they don't have to be me. And I think a lot of us try and hire in our self-image as well. And again, that's just, that's evolutionary psychology. It makes you feel reassured if you come across someone that it's mirror neurons and all that stuff, how your brain works, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess a challenge to this kind of ties in a little bit to the third point we're going to talk about around how things have changed since the liquid days. Because I asked you this question before we came live, and you said, culture is one thing I feel that has changed a lot, that we don't have these vibrant, noisy sales floors like we used to, for example. There's none of these animal spirits, as it were, out there being, I wouldn't say aggressive, but particularly loud and pretty confident. That's the kind of style that we know. I guess the battle then comes in. That's the kind of persona that we identify as being someone that's going to be successful in sales, someone who's got the energy, has got the drive, has got the competitive spirit. We tend to find them when we're hiring that we look for those kind of people who tend to be like us, because that's the kind of nature that we've got as entrepreneurs, right? So how do you separate that, where you have in your mind the idea of what makes a successful person on the sales floor, someone who's a bit louder, a bit more confident maybe, with still at the same time saying in the hiring process, it's got to be logical. It's got to be based on more than just, do I like this person? Are they like me? Because you can kind of see where the clash in the middle exists between those two beliefs, right?
Well, I just to push back a little bit, I don't think the loud, brash people are. Like, some of the best recruiters I've ever worked with were like silent assassins. You didn't see them coming. And I mean that I don't mean that in a unscrupulous way. I mean that in the sense that they weren't that typical wide boy, sort of flash recruiter that people do have this image of from back in the day. But I don't know how true that was. I think that was relevant to, cultures are different. Every business is different. And lots of businesses might have been like that, but certainly not the one that I worked in. Some of the best people I worked with were actually very quiet and unassuming.
I hear it all the time that the best salespeople are the introverts. They're the ones to watch out for.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, it's because they don't come off as they're selling to you, is what I often experience a lot when dealing with people like that. I don't feel like I'm being aggressively sold to. It feels much like they're there to listen, to understand. They're still professional. They're still salespeople. But it's not like you say, the wide boy, all right, mate, you come and do a deal with me here or not. It's much more
No
considered.
One trusts the breathless salesperson.
Yes, exactly.
And like, sales breath is smelly. And so, I couldn't agree more. So I think, just to push back on that bit, I people have this perception of recruitment. I started out in recruitment just about 20 years ago now. Not quite, actually. When was it? Yeah, about 20 years ago. And there's always some loud and brash people, but I think on most recruitment sales floors you're going to find that. But I think quite the opposite. There's lots of those ones that you're describing as well.
And how do you think that marries up with the whole, again, the vibrancy, where sales floors are quieter today than they used to be, where the phone isn't utilized as often? Admittedly, I think a lot of people jump on this as people are just lazy, they don't want to pick up the phone these days. Partly, but there's also far more channels to work these days. Like, LinkedIn wasn't really a thing 20 odd years ago, for example. Now you can't imagine doing recruitment without it, right? Everything has changed so much since back then.
Yeah, there's a number of factors there, and I must admit, it is a shame, because there was nothing more magical for me than walking onto a sales floor of lots of driven, proactive recruiters. And you could just hear, you mentioned the word animal spirits. Animal spirits is real, and you could hear the vibrancy. You could hear, you just sense that high performance just by walking onto the floor. And it was a really magical feeling for me. And that has disappeared a bit, as you say, because it's multi-touch, multi-channel, cadences now. a lot of the stuff that you do, we were talking about this earlier from an investment perspective, has moved away from being direct high value sales. And there's an awful lot of administrative management that you have to do as being a good recruiter, which means naturally, therefore, the animal spirits just aren't the same. And it's going to be interesting to see how that changes over time, because I do have a bit of a theory how a lot of AI and automation is actually going to move away from that again. And I think sales floors are going to be smaller than they were, because businesses won't be getting scaled purely on headcount anymore. I think technology and productivity is going to improve a lot without necessarily adding headcount. So I think we are going to have smaller businesses, but I think actually recruitment consultants are going to go back to doing lots and lots of high value sales stuff, rather than a lot of the administrative like dirge that they have to get through at this moment in time with regards to managing
Massively agree.
systems that you've described. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that shift goes, but I think we'll have smaller businesses, but I do think the atmosphere is going to start coming back a little bit because of what I'm describing.
I completely agree. Like, it's one thing that we're looking at a lot lately and thinking about is like, there's all this talk about AI all the time, right? I've always said that AI is going to be an augmenter rather than a replacer. It will let you spend more of your time doing the things that only humans can do, which realistically is things like building a relationship and having a decent conversation with someone where you truly have empathy for their situation. But a really good example of it is like in our sales team, like we're remote at the minute. There's 8 people in that team. We use like an online sales floor, which I know sounds really weird. It's like, just get on a sales floor for God's sake. It's a good bit of kit. But one thing that's come with, and some will not like this, there is like a parallel dialer built into it as well. So we can call through 5 numbers at the same time. And what it means is, yes, we're going through a lot of numbers, but by the same token, it means that our team are actually having more conversations throughout the day. They're not spending 5 hours a day sat there waiting for voicemails to go through or listen to a ringing tone. They're actually getting to have real conversations far more frequently. And so that's where I think tech has really got a good chance to improve things, is it will mean you have more time to do the things that only a human can do.
Couldn't agree more. And I love the sound of that dialer.
It's fantastic. It's very
Some people
good.
will hate it. They will. But again, you said earlier that, is it a cultural thing where people, I do genuinely, because the reality is when you're in an environment where you've got multiple options how to communicate with someone, the communication method that, again, evolutionary psychology, right? We all hate rejection. No one likes rejection. So what is the your go-to like analysis there is, what's the mode of communication which actually reduces the level of rejection I'm going to receive and the pain that's going to cause me? And it's not phone, is it? So I think it's really, really easy to hide behind activities that are less high priority from a channel perspective. So I do think that's there. And the truth is that people nowadays don't talk on the phone as much. Everything's done via text. It's all these different channels. So people are growing up in a different environment where phone communication is not your go-to method of communication. So I think that then does drip down, and you see less. You see culturally on sales floors, because less people are on the phone, there's less need to be on the phone to be like everyone else. And also, I think from a generational perspective, I think just as a mode of communication, it's less used now.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll be an absolute hypocrite in saying this, but like my team obviously make a lot of phone calls throughout the day because we know that, being honest, a lot of recruiters do like speaking on the phone. It's kind of part of their job. It's how they've built their careers, is being on the phone. Whereas myself as an engineer, that's not great for me. I get distracted. My phone goes off all day. I'm like, if I answer that phone, I'm going to be out of work mode for the next 15, 20 minutes and I'm not getting back into it. And so I actually have a voicemail that says, look, email me or text me. That has been my voicemail for about 12 months. Guess how many people have texted me in that time period?
Go on.
2. I've had 2 texts in that time period. I just say, look, text me what it's about. That's probably the best way to get me, because that channel is so underutilized, yet no one really does. And so there's a degree of, yes, having a real human conversation is so valuable, but also kind of think about the person you're trying to get in touch with. Where do they like to be contacted? If it's not the phone, okay, fine, put the phone down for a minute. Would I recommend going through LinkedIn these days? Maybe no. But something like WhatsApp or a text, even a voice note, that's what someone might like to receive. Try all these different channels. Don't keep on trying to bang your head through a brick wall when you know it's not going to work for that person.
Understand your buyer persona, isn't it? I can understand why you guys do lots of phone calls, because you're dealing with sales leaders.
Recruiters love the phone.
They'll answer the phone, and they're more than likely, or there's a good chance, probability-wise, they'll have a conversation with you. Phoning engineers,
no chance.
Techies.
One of the hardest ones in the world to get on the phone, that's for sure. Every now and then I'm just like, I'll answer this one and see what it's all about. And to be fair, I've had some really good cold calls off the back of it and had now really good like conversations with people that not even about products strictly, but like this one guy called Christian who I must have been cold called about 4 years ago, and he rang me. I was just about to go into a meeting. I was like, I thought you're the person I was going into a meeting with. I'm not available to talk right now. And he was like, yeah, okay, no, I'll let you go, but I will call you back. And I really laughed when he said that. And I was like, all right, fair enough. Call me back on Thursday at 11. And he rang me and we had a really good chat, took a demo, all the rest of it. Although I didn't buy, we've had a really good relationship since then where we check in every few months with each other, see how things are going, for example. And just every now and then you do get a good cold call that comes through. It's definitely outweighed by a lot of the bad ones, but it's very fun.
Start pitching Derry over the phone. Anyone who wants to sell Derry anything, he does occasionally answer his phone.
Very, very occasionally is the problem. I probably answered about 3 in the last 6 weeks.
Derry, it's too late. You answer your phone and you're sellable, is what I just heard.
If I answer the phone, that's always the big if. That's the challenge to get through. If I'm in a good mood that day, I'll probably answer it at least twice.
Every day for a month.
And they'll believe it's urgent, he'll answer you and then have a conversation with you. Yeah, very possibly. But the whole like methods of business development, I think, are a really interesting conversation overall. To come back to the point we were talking about was around the whole like how things have changed since Liquid. What do you think has been the biggest shift that you've seen outside of maybe culture specifically? What has been the biggest shift for you that you've observed that you think people really need to stay ahead of?
Look, I think, AI and automation.
You can't say LinkedIn either.
No, I'm not going to say LinkedIn. I'm just going to say like automated cadences are massive because it gives you the ability to be able to analyze from a data perspective what's working. And we've spoken there. And again, that like there is not a one size fits all approach that is the right thing for all industries, all verticals, etc., etc. We've spoken about different, buyer personas. Then you've got the different ICPs that you're selling into. There's such a variety of things, so many variables, which will determine what an optimal outreach methodology is. And that's via whatever channel it is, how many approaches you should be making, how long that time frame should be that you continue before it goes, you put it on ice. There's so many things there now which have made things a lot more complicated, but also, if done correctly, give you the ability to be able to analyze what works and also understand the underlying data from a volume and from a conversion perspective, and then reverse engineer that stuff back to be able to understand what you need to do moving forward to be able to achieve certain results based upon that data. So I think the level of data you get now as a business, I think, again, the danger there is that you drown in it. But I think the real superpower is that if you can really understand that small segment of data that is super important to your organization, I think it gives you a really tight understanding of the different levers you need to pull, and also the coaching and development opportunities you have as a business with regards to understanding why John Smith is doing better than Jane Smith, and understanding the underlying data there, stat ranking different people. So I think the danger is you drown in it. But I think if you can get your head on, I think if you can get on top of it and you can have an effective reporting system focused on the really, really important stuff and focus on one or two improvement areas at a time, I think it gives you a brilliant way to be able to understand the science behind the algorithm of what works for your business from an outreach perspective.
I love it. And I love how that's also come back full circle to where we started around processing data. Strange world where everything is connected. How strange.
As long as you don't lose sight of the cultural bit as well, of course, of course, culture's everything. So, this stuff isn't just on its own, is it? You have to have a holistic view of all of the different things that are important and make sure you're focused on the right things.
I do want to ask you one more question about culture before we get into the quick fire round now I think about it. I think one thing every business leader will be able to remember, or at least think about, is we all get to that point where we say, how do we protect this culture when we're 10 people bigger? How do we protect this culture when we're at 20 heads? How do we do it when we're at 40? How do we do it at 60? How do we do it at 80, for example? How did you find, or what point did you find culture kind of took on a life of its own? And what surprised you about that journey of steps that you were going through? Was there any point where the culture became a bit of a beast where you're like, oh God, I have zero control over this anymore? And at what point did that happen?
Yeah, we were definitely at one point. So as a an honest example, we were working very, very hard, but we were playing too hard as well. And, Thursday nights out, people weren't getting to their desk on time on the Friday morning. It got a bit out of control at one point, and because we had a lot of fun and we were so tight as a business, and we got on so well, and there was more of a drinking culture back then than everyone's a lot healthier and more fitness orientated now, I think. And this isn't that long ago, but I do think there was more of a drinking culture back in the day in recruitment. So I think it got a bit out of control at one point, and we definitely had to start reining that in. I think as a general rule, culture does change as the business scales, and that's absolutely fine and normal. And you have to be accepting of that, because as your baby grows up, the culture is going to change a bit, and that's normal. So I think you have to be aware of that and accept it. But I think for me, one of the biggest challenges you have as a business leader is identifying the right leaders who are going to continue driving your business forward beneath you. And I think those individuals are the ones that are going to drive the culture, because again, every time you make yourself redundant and move yourself up the pyramid or the organogram, you become one layer further removed from the workforce as a whole.
Yeah.
So I think every layer you go up, the leaders beneath you are the fundamental drivers of your values, your non-negotiables, and all of that sort of good stuff. So I think the critical piece there is making sure you've got people who live and breathe the values of your business beneath you from a leadership perspective. And then it does start to take on an identity of its own to a degree. The business I had, Liquid, I don't know, let's say there was 7 or 8 different business units. Each had a different business leader who was either an associate director or a director. Each had its own unique culture to a degree. So don't get me wrong, they all had the same fundamental culture. I'm going to say 80 or 90% of the businesses were very similar. 70 or 80% of their culture was very, very similar. But I think there was probably 10, 20% which was unique to each business unit. And again, that's perfectly normal, because that's driven by the business leader. Joe is very different to Jane. They're different individuals, and
they'll hire different people, tolerate different things, have different values potentially, so on.
The way they behave is different.
Yeah.
This person's more aggressive than this person who's more conservative from a sales perspective. This person is more phone orientated. This person is more social media. I don't know what it might be. I'm putting out some really weird examples there, but it's part of the process, and it's the leaders that drive your culture.
Yeah, I really like that. And it's a really interesting point for us. It's kind of the one non-negotiable I have, is that a leader needs to be someone that those underneath them trust, look up to, take inspiration from. Otherwise, that's when you start getting bad culture, and bad culture can spread very quickly, right? It only takes one sour apple to spoil the bunch, as you hear so many times really over, and I think it can be very, very true.
I agree with that 100%. It sounds like a cliche. It's not.
It is.
And I've seen some interesting studies of that, how like they say that you can have 5 people who are culture adds, and then you can have one person who's a culture detractor. And the impact of the culture detractor is literally more impactful than those 5 positive people. So
yeah,
they've actually done studies on it, and it's really interesting. And you have to take that stuff with a little bit of pinch of salt. But
I'd completely take it. Like, I know we've had past staff from a few years ago who were exactly like that, right? Who I'd say, we've got some brilliant performers around them, but they're so bogged down by that one person that it does take away from their little edge, the little sheen they've got that they bring to the business, and it can. It's crazy. It's like you'd rather have a hole than an arsehole, is what so many people have said, is the little saying that I hear. You'd rather have a hole in the business, a seat that's empty for an amount of time, rather than having the wrong person in it because of what they do to everyone else around them.
And once that toxicity is in the other people, it's really hard to get it back out again. It's weird. It is. So you think just by getting rid of that person, problem solved? No, it's not. Because actually, if they've been involved in the business for a long enough time to have a big impact or influence on the people around them, it's quite hard to come back for the people that they've influenced.
It is really hard, unless you can do some absolute magic. But really, if it's got to that point where it's no longer fixable, you'd probably let that person sit there and fester a little bit too long, in my view.
Agreed.
Awesome. Well, we've had a good chat for a good 45 minutes there. I'm always conscious of going too far over time. So we'll jump into the quick fire round. I've got a few quick fire questions for you, just little things that are like those little random ones out there. We'll start with, what is your favourite business book that you've read?
Oh, it's too many. One, goodness me.
Pick one out of your favorite list. It hasn't got to be the golden book.
I tell you what, we talked about process at the beginning, and I'm always keen to be honest when I'm just plagiarizing stuff. So a book that really changed fundamentally how I looked at process in order to be able to build the right sales processes for scalability was Cracking the Sales Management Code by a guy called, I think it's Jason Jordan. And there's an accompanying piece that goes with that. He's an American guy. There's an accompanying piece called Coaching, I think it is. No, Crushing Quota. And that's the coaching framework, which is aligned to kind of like the Science of Sales Management, which is the first book. So I think it's good to give a shout out to those those accompanying pieces based upon the conversation we've had, and the fact I just ripped him off with regards to his sales processes and then turned them into recruitment equivalent processes.
If it works, why not? Fair play. Favorite podcasts? Have you listened to podcasts?
I haven't been listening to podcasts, recruitment orientated ones, much recently, but I am a podcast junkie.
Okay, it does say a recruitment focused one. What podcasts do you enjoy?
I got into SaaSta a lot with my the investment that I was doing. So obviously, the previous recruitment business I was involved with was a SaaS sales business. So SaaSta was like a big one for me. 30 Minutes to President's Club, I quite enjoyed that one. I think there's one by a guy called John Kaplan, which I really, really enjoyed. This is kind of like sales and scaling stuff, all within the SaaS space. I can't think what his was called. Force Management is the name of his company, and he kind of came out of that medic school of
it rings a bell. Yeah, I can't think of what it is either.
I can't think, but yeah, there's some examples of ones that previously I was really into, which were more sort of recruitment and business orientated.
The SaaSta one is very, very. I used to listen to that one. Always Harry Stebbings' intro every single time. I always just absolutely love listening to that back in the day.
Yeah.
These days it's more like the high performance podcasts and things like that, but a lot of love for the SaaSta podcast when we were getting started as a business. What about, and this is always a term that I hate saying, everyone knows who listens to podcasts will know this, your favorite LinkedIn influencer?
Ooh.
I'm going to say influencer. It's not going to be someone with like hundreds of thousands of followers. It can be someone that you know is maybe a little bit smaller but offers really valuable content.
The truth is, I don't want to say one particular person because I've got some good, like I've built some good friendships on LinkedIn ships. So I wouldn't want to pick out one person. There's some really, really good people. If you go onto my feed, you'll see all the people lots of the people I engage with. There's loads of good people on LinkedIn, but I wouldn't want to call out one because then I'm basically insulting all the others. I'm just going to be a wimp, Terry. Basically, I'm wimping out.
You're really backing out there and keeping that fence warm, aren't you?
100%. I'm not burning any bridges.
Excellent. Very good. And if you could give a top tip to an aspiring manager, someone that maybe has been a top individual performer for a long time, wants to become a manager, and they're like, where do I get started here? What's the best advice you can give them?
Read those 2 books I just said. Get reading. Like, the problem is if you're surrounded by great leaders, you can learn a lot by osmosis. But the truth is that, any success that I've had has been based upon standing on the shoulders of giants. There's an awful lot of stuff online, but I do think the quality of information you'll get from the right books, I think books still beat the internet with regards to the depth of information they go into in certain subjects. So I think reach out to me and I can certainly recommend some really, really good books on pretty much any subject matter, as I'm sure you can. But I think taking responsibility for your own self-development and asking people who can point you in the right direction, who've probably done the heavy lifting, because 90% of books you don't read again, but it's that 10% of books that you find which really open your eyes and make you think differently, which you go back to time and time again. I think reaching out to people who've maybe done the heavy lifting and have got rid of the 90% and can point you towards the 10%, I think is really valuable to any aspiring manager.
I've definitely recommended this before on the podcast. The one book, I can't believe there's a whole book on it, the Checklist Manifesto. You ever read that?
I have, yeah.
That, to me, again, ties back into the whole theme of this podcast around process, for example, and just how they talk about how the hell they build skyscrapers or massive bridges, for example, yet very rarely they ever collapse or have problems. It all comes through a checklist that is just extremely well documented, that everyone is very aware of. And again, hundreds of pages about a checklist. A checklist is absolutely bonkers, but it's actually a really good read.
It is a good read. It does repeat itself a little bit, but
to reinforce the message, it does its best. Yeah.
Any recruiter who doesn't follow a formulaic template when they're registering or qualifying or whatever you call it, interviewing a candidate, they shouldn't be in the industry. Because look, I did it for a long, long time, and every single time I interviewed someone, every time I took a job brief, it's the same thing as the Checklist Manifesto. People who just say they can do it off the top of their head, no, you can't. And there's a reason for that, and they should read that book.
I love that. Awesome. Cool. Coming up to a close then. Any shout outs you want to give? Want to point at anyone, any particular direction if they want to get in touch with you to ask any questions?
Well, I'm readily available on LinkedIn. So it's Alex Elliott, 2 L's.
Like any good recruiter or ex-recruiter in this case, I suppose.
That's it. Yeah.
I'm curious what comes next. Obviously, you're done with liquid, you invest in a bunch of companies since then, you're still staying busy. Any appetite to get back in and do it all over again?
Not at the moment. I'm an old man now, Derry. You aged me at the beginning by talking about like what's changed. I think I love recruitment, and I think hopefully I can offer some value, whether that's investing in recruitment businesses or tech startups within this space. But I think maybe I've got to that point now where hopefully it's my advice and cold hard cash, which is where I can have the biggest leverage rather than actually doing the work myself.
Very good. Makes a lot of sense.
Basically, I'm lazy now, Derry.
Let everyone else do the work and I'll talk and give some advice.
Out. That's pretty much what I just said, isn't it? So yeah. You do all the hard work and I'll just sit back in the background and give you general pointers, which is obviously hugely valuable to most people.
Yeah, I was about to say, it's that expertise that you pay for though, when someone's been there, done that and got the battle scars for it that can help you avoid those hurdles. It's worth its weight in gold. Absolutely.
Well, I've certainly got the scars.
Amazing. Alex, that has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for jumping on the podcast and look forward to this one coming out.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks, David.